Civil war continues to tear Syria apart. There was a leadership transition in China. A horrific mass shooting sparks calls for greater gun control in the US, and Aung San Suu Kyi gets a seat in Parliament as Burma's regime embraces democratic reforms. Those are just some of the international stories that shaped 2012.
Certainly, and plenty more too. And for a look at the International Year in Review, we're joined by Dr. Scott Birchall, who is a Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Deakin University, and Jim Middleton, the presenter of Newsline on the ABC and the Australian Network. And with us in Sydney is Dr. Adam Lockyer from the University of Sydney's US Studies Centre. Thanks all for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
It's almost hard to know where to start.
Well, where do you want to start?
Well, look, can we start with the US and China leadership changes in China, and of course Barack Obama's re-election, because I think with the fiscal cliff likely to be the first big story of 2013, it seems logical perhaps to start there for 2012, as that being the setup.
Well, I won't talk about the United States. I will talk about China and the China leadership, which the transition there, once in a decade, doesn't happen very often, as you can see. And 10 years ago when it did, of course, China was a much diminished power by comparison with what it is today. But for Australia's purposes, what's happened in China with the installation of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and the new Standing Committee of the Politburo, effectively the new cabinet, is of as great a significance, I would suggest, as what's happened in the United States with the election of Barack Obama. Both have significant economic consequences for Australia. The fiscal cliff in the United States obviously could be quite drastic in terms of consequences for our economy as well as for the economic well-being of the United States. But the way in which China goes into 2013 as our biggest export market, our biggest trading partner, very, very significant indeed. But allied to that too were the changes in leadership in both Japan and South Korea in the latter months of this year, with the LDP returning to power in Japan, Shinzo Abe, and the new president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye. And the implications there are both economic for Australia. 40% of our trade is now with those three countries, but also in terms of international relations too, and undoubtedly we'll talk about this as the morning goes on, because there are significant strategic questions in both the East China and South China Seas. So there we go.
Let's bring in the US. Adam Lockyer, what do you say of Barack Obama staying in office? It's easy to say now that it was a sure thing, but it certainly wasn't a few months ago.
Oh, that's right. So during the election campaign, Barack Obama was always ahead, and he was always expected to win. And so that's what we saw. In terms of foreign policy, we're likely now to see steady as she goes. The Obama doctrine is now pretty much set with the pivot towards Asia and trying to stay out of Syria as much as they can. So in terms of foreign policy, we're not likely to see very much change. But in the second term of Obama's presidency, we're likely to see a significant change in domestic policy. So we're likely to see him push harder on environmental issues, likely to see him try and push through immigration, but before he can move on to all those issues, he's got to deal with the fiscal cliff.
Now, Dr. Scott Birchall, of course, what happens in the US, there was certainly a lot of hope with the re-election of President Barack Obama that a second-term president might be more willing to be engaged in Middle East and the peace process there. Yep. But certainly this year has been a very big one for the Middle East, in particular what's happening in Syria. Yes,
just about the US first, and you usually expect a second-term US president to feel less shackled by the need to be re-elected and raise money for another election campaign, and therefore a bit more active in the second term. But I was just saying to Jim off air, I'm not sure that we're getting a sense that Obama has the energy at this point or an agenda for a second term that is going to be strikingly different from the first one, and that will, I think, disappoint a few of his supporters who believe that given he's only got 4 years to go, and in about 3 years' time people will stop taking any notice of him because they'll be focusing on the next election. He has a window of 3 years to do something, and it's not clear that there's a really strong international agenda there, and we're seeing it in the case of Syria, where the US wants the rebels to succeed, but there's no evidence that there's a clear, decisive victory for either side in the forthcoming months.
Or a way for the international community to help them do that.
Well, you know, there was a very interesting article by Patrick Coburn in the Independent yesterday saying that the Syrian regime still holds all the major towns and cities in Syria. The rebels have been looting some of the areas that they've captured. They're getting some US base support through Turkish bases and other financial instruments, but there's no clear decisive winner in Syria in the forthcoming months, and that's going to be a further misery for the population who have suffered terribly really since March last year.
The other matter that's that the President of the United States has faced in the last month has been after the Newtown massacre with gun laws being debated. Do you see the same sort of lack of energy, as you say, or is he too shackled? I mean,
well,
that's another one that people are sending in this morning. Their hashtag big story 2012 is that shooting in the US.
Well, someone tweeted yesterday that that Obama has actually won the election in November last year by a larger margin than the membership of the NRA in the US. But again, this is such a sensitive issue. It just depends on whether he's going to use up political capital to achieve some kind of legacy that he really wants to lay down. That's the question. Will he try and just manage his way through the next 4 years, or does he want to make a decisive difference?
I'll be interested to know what Adam thinks about this, but I do suspect, and my experience in the United States is a long time ago now, but I do wonder whether there are just simply too many guns in the place, that even if you were to introduce the laws which could control them, whether you could actually get them out of the hands of the people who have them, and whether there hasn't been an attitudinal shift among the general population of the United States, where now ordinary people like you and me only feel safe with a gun in the home rather than in getting other people to give them up.
Dr. Adam Lockyer, clearly gun control is not only a big issue for 2012 but will be for 2013 as well.
Yes, so the President has nominated Joe Biden, his Vice President, to try and push through gun reform through the Congress. This is an uphill battle. It's unlikely to get much traction, at least in the short term. They'll introduce a bill early in 2013 to try and ban assault weapons, but that's unlikely to get much of a play in Congress. The Republicans are firmly against bringing back into the assault weapons ban, and the NRA is one of the most powerful lobby groups in DC, so it's unlikely to get much traction, although the bill will be introduced in 2013.
And we'll go back to Jim Middleton now. Aung San Suu Kyi is a name that we're seeing on Twitter this morning as people reflect on
what was a rather grim year internationally, you'd have to say, what was Syria, and we're just talking about guns there in the United States, and other traumas and trials and tribulations elsewhere. The emergence of Aung San Suu Kyi and the changes that have occurred in Burma over the last 2 years have been quite remarkable. I was there in March when she won a seat in the Parliament. The expectations that the general population have of her are almost unrealisable. The difficulty that she now faces is having gone from being seen as part of the solution. The danger is that she becomes part of the problem. Once you're inside the tent rather than outside it, it's quite significant and quite difficult. And the issue that you can see where she is having considerable trouble is with the Rohingya, the Muslim minority in the northwest of Burma, who have been oppressed for decades, if not centuries, who are not even regarded, even though there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, as citizens of Burma. And not only is this a problem for the Burmese authorities, but also for Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been really quite muted in what she has had to say about their plight. And if that is the case, what does that say about her intentions for the future? She's walking a very delicate line between being able to be this standard bearer, this very, very significant figure for and mover for political change, but at the same time now being part of the operation as well. It's very difficult.
It can be the case that you have a big momentous step forward that can sometimes lead to a couple of steps backwards, and that's probably analogous to what's going on in Egypt as well. We have seen with the Arab uprising, but now 2012 very much dominated by the difficulties that have come from previous big news.
Look, could I just say about Suu Kyi that she faces and she's compared with Mandela quite often. I think we'll see a very similar pattern, that is a very important galvanising opposition force, but a fairly ordinary performer in government, if that's in fact the position she ultimately takes.
Well, the problems that they face are so extraordinary, and you can already see it becoming cowboy country. It's like the new Klondike in Burma. People, all sorts of spivs and ne'er-do-wells are getting in there, and there are going to be significant problems, I would imagine, in developing the resources, taking Burma out of poverty into matching the performance of its Southeast Asian neighbours. And there's just so many difficulties that, as you say, you have Aung San Suu Kyi as this galvanising force, but with so many difficulties to manage and so many problems, her ability to meet the expectations of the community are impossible.
Well, even the infrastructure of the country is struggling to keep up with the tourists who want to go there now. There just aren't sufficient hotels, and it's just not set up yet for the number of people who want to go. As far as Egypt is concerned, look, it's been a very disappointing year, I think, for Egypt, because we saw such a tremendous momentum in January last year with the revolution and the ousting of Mubarak. And of course, since that time, we've had the election of President Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood, and a very interesting set of circumstances a few months back where Morsi played an interesting bargaining role in the ceasefire for Gaza between the Israelis and Hamas, and then proceeded to almost hijack the constitution and Islamicise it to the point where he managed to divide the opposition into deciding either to boycott it or to oppose it, therefore getting it through in the way that he wanted to. And there is a great deal of concern that he's resembling the person that he preceded him.
And that was always the risk.
Always the risk, but you know, he travels in convoys, he gives set-piece speeches, he seems to be doing a deal with the army so that, and is moving closer to the US after initial fears that he would take a more independent line on Israel. So I think for a lot of particularly young Egyptians, there's a great deal of concern about the direction of politics in the country, and the economy is struggling very, very badly.
And before we go back to Adam and just talk about the US financial-wise, very quickly, Scott, what do you see happening there in Egypt? January is going to be a big month.
Look,
January 25.
The protests, the anniversary of the revolution on the 25th will be a very significant event. President Morsi was barricaded in his own palace there at one stage about a month back, and people go to Tahrir Square to protest about developments in the country that they're opposed to and they're concerned about. I guess he can argue now that constitutionally he's the legitimate leader, and his vote was legitimate, although a large percentage of the population simply didn't turn up or didn't support his constitutional changes. But it is very concerning for those who thought Egypt would have a new beginning, that some of these opportunities have not been followed through, and we're just sort of recycling the old authoritarian line of Mubarak and the military leaders who preceded him.
Now, one big news story that has affected all parts of the world this year has been the economy, and particularly coming out of Europe. We see China at one end helping push with growth. We have the Middle East and much of Europe as well being caught in woes, but so much is still driven by the US. And Adam Lockyer, if we can ask you to look at what has been a big issue, obviously the fiscal cliff. There's been a very big build-up to where we are today, and that's been a huge part of the news agenda, how it's affected news and the economy around the world.
Yes, so the US economy is still very fragile. Its recovery is a slow one. It's coming out of a deep recession, so the housing market is starting to stabilise, unemployment is starting to drop, and so things are improving, but very slowly. It's very delicate at this stage. So the fiscal cliff is going to be a major issue, because it could be significant enough to drag the United States back into recession. So the United States growth last year was at 2.5%. If the fiscal cliff occurs, which it looks like it's going to, and it remains in place for 12 months, people are expecting a drag on the economy of about 3.5% GDP growth, which is back into a deep recession. So this could be a huge problem for the United States. But people aren't really talking about the fiscal cliff going for 12 months. It's, well, what damage is going to be done to the US economy if we go over the cliff and we're there for 1 or 2 or 3 months? What damage is that going to do to the US economy and the world economy?
Certainly. Adam Lockyer in Sydney, thanks for taking us through some of the top stories that have come out of the US this year. And thanks also Jim Middleton and Scott Birchall for looking around the world at Big News 2012.
My pleasure, and Happy New Year.
Absolutely.
Yes.